In a small, bustling town in America, life moved at its own pace. The streets were lined with cozy homes, local shops, and community centers where neighbors often gathered to share stories or catch up on the latest news. But beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful town, tensions had been simmering for years. The relationship between law enforcement and certain communities, particularly those of color, had grown strained. Stories of unfair treatment, racial profiling, and harsh encounters with police officers were whispered about in barbershops, churches, and family dinners. It was a problem that many tried to ignore, but it refused to go away. Officer Mark Reynolds was a familiar face around town. A veteran cop who had served on the force for over 2 decades, he was known for his tough demeanor and no-nonsense attitude. To some, he was a symbol of authority and discipline. To others, he was someone to avoid if possible. Over the years, rumors had circulated about Mark's behavior during traffic stops, neighborhood patrols, and even casual interactions. Some said he treated people differently based on their skin color. Others claimed they'd seen him speak rudely or aggressively to individuals who didn't deserve such treatment. Whether these stories were entirely true or exaggerated, one thing was clear. Mark had a reputation that preceded him. On this particular evening, the air was crisp, and the sky was painted orange as the sun began to set. The local police precinct buzzed with activity. Officers came and went, responding to calls and filing reports. Outside, a crowd had gathered near the entrance, drawn by curiosity or perhaps concern. Among them stood FBI Director Elena Martinez, an extraordinary figure in her own right. As the first Latina to hold the prestigious position, she had broken barriers and shattered glass ceilings throughout her career. Her presence commanded respect, not just because of her title, but also because of her unwavering dedication to justice and fairness. Elena had arrived unannounced, part of a routine visit to assess how federal resources were being utilized at the local level. She believed strongly in connecting with communities directly, ensuring that the work of the FBI aligned with the needs of everyday citizens. Dressed casually in jeans and a blazer, she blended into the crowd outside the precinct. No one paid much attention to her initially, until Officer Mark approached the scene. Mark had been called to investigate what he thought was a minor disturbance near the station. When he arrived, his eyes scanned the area quickly, taking in the faces of those present. His gaze landed on Elena almost immediately. Something about her appearance caught his attention, not because she looked out of place, but because his mind jumped to conclusions before he could think twice. Without hesitation, he assumed she wasn't supposed to be there. Maybe she was loitering, he thought, or worse, maybe she was involved in something illegal. "Hey, you!" Mark barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "What are you doing here?" Elena turned toward him, surprised by the sudden accusation. She studied him carefully, noting the way his hand hovered near the holster of his gun. Despite the tension in the air, she remained calm. "I'm here for official business," she replied, evenly. "Is there a problem?" Her response seemed to irritate Mark further. Instead of listening, he doubled down. "Official business? What kind of official business? You don't look like you belong here." The comment stung, though Elena didn't. Let it show. She pulled out her identification badge, holding it up so he could see it clearly. "I'm FBI Director Elena Martinez," she said firmly. "If you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them, but I suggest we do this respectfully." For a moment, Mark hesitated. The name rang a bell. He'd heard it mentioned in passing, during department meetings. Still, pride and prejudice clouded his judgment. He glanced at the badge but dismissed it almost instantly. In his mind, someone like her couldn't possibly hold such a high-ranking position. It didn't fit the narrative he'd constructed in his head. Rather than stepping back or apologizing, he leaned in closer, his tone growing more confrontational. "You expect me to believe that?" he sneered, his words dripping with disbelief. "You're telling me you're the big boss around here?" Elena's patience was wearing thin, but she kept her composure. "Yes, I am, and I'd appreciate it if you addressed me with the respect my role deserves." By now, a small crowd had formed around them. People watched nervously, unsure of what might happen next. Some recognized Elena and whispered among themselves, confirming her identity. Others simply stared, captivated by the unfolding drama. For Mark, the growing audience only fueled his frustration. He felt cornered, as if everyone was judging him. His ego took over, pushing reason aside. "This isn't over," he muttered, his hand inching closer to his weapon. The movement sent a ripple of fear through the crowd. Someone gasped audibly while another person reached for their phone to record the interaction. Elena noticed the shift in energy and raised her hand slightly, signaling that she meant no harm. "Officer Reynolds," she said, using his last name deliberately. "I understand you may have concerns, but escalating the situation won't help anyone. Let's talk this through calmly." But calm was the last thing on Mark's mind. His biases had taken control, overriding any semblance of professionalism. He ignored her words, focusing instead on his own anger and insecurity. In his distorted view, he was the authority figure, and she was challenging him. A challenge he couldn't tolerate. As the seconds ticked by, the tension escalated. Every word exchanged added fuel to the fire, turning what should have been a simple misunderstanding into something far more dangerous. Neither Elena nor Mark realized it yet, but this encounter would change both their lives forever and spark a nationwide conversation about race, power, and accountability within law enforcement. The atmosphere outside the police precinct grew heavier with each passing second. Officer Mark Reynolds stood face to face with FBI Director Elena Martinez, his body tense and his jaw clenched. The crowd around them watched in stunned silence, unsure of what might happen next. Elena's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Mark's escalating frustration. Despite her repeated attempts to defuse the situation, Mark seemed determined to push it further. "This isn't over." "Mark, I muttered again, his voice low but laced with hostility. He shifted his weight slightly, his hand now resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. The movement was subtle, but it didn't go unnoticed. Someone in the crowd audibly gasped, while others instinctively took a step back, creating more space between themselves and the unfolding drama. A few people pulled out their phones, recording the scene as it unfolded. They knew this moment could be important, something that needed to be documented for accountability. Elena noticed the shift in energy immediately. She remained composed, her years of experience in high-pressure situations serving her well. Raising her hand slightly in a non-threatening gesture, she spoke again, her tone measured but firm. "Officer Reynolds," she said, addressing him directly, "I understand you may have concerns, but pointing a weapon is not the solution. Let's resolve this peacefully." Her words should have been enough to make anyone pause. After all, she wasn't just any civilian. She was the head of one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the country. Yet instead of calming him down, her response only seemed to infuriate Mark further. His pride had taken a hit, and he couldn't let go of the idea that someone like her, a woman of color, was standing up to him. In his mind, authority meant control, and he couldn't fathom being challenged, especially in front of an audience. "You think you can come here and tell me what to do?" Mark snapped, his voice rising loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You don't get to lecture me about how to do my job." Elena didn't flinch. She'd dealt with difficult personalities before, both within and outside the FBI. Her focus was always on de-escalation, finding ways to bring volatile situations under control without resorting to aggression. But this time felt different. This wasn't just about managing a confrontation. It was about setting an example. If she backed down now, it would send a dangerous message that people in positions of power could act recklessly without consequences. "Officer Reynolds," she tried once more, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "I am not questioning your ability to do your job. However, we must conduct ourselves professionally at all times. That includes showing respect to others regardless of rank or background." Her words hung in the air, sharp and pointed, leaving no room for misinterpretation. For a brief moment, Mark hesitated. Perhaps some part of him recognized the absurdity of the situation, the fact that he was arguing with someone who outranked him by miles. But then, something inside him snapped. Whether it was pride, fear, or deeply ingrained prejudice, he made a choice that would change everything. Before anyone could react, Mark drew his weapon. The metallic click of the gun leaving its holster echoed through the street, freezing everyone in place. Time seemed to stand still as the barrel of the firearm pointed directly at Elena. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of disbelief. No one could believe what they were witnessing. Was this really happening? Had a police officer just pulled a gun on the director of the FBI? Elena's heart raced, but she refused to show fear. Looking straight into Mark's eyes, she kept her hands raised and spoke slowly, deliberately. "Officer Reynolds, put your weapon down. This is unnecessary and highly inappropriate." Her calmness was unnerving, even to Mark. Deep down, he might have realized the gravity of his actions, but it was too late to turn back now. His finger hovered near the trigger, his breathing heavy and uneven. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would he pull the trigger, or would reason prevail? It was at that exact moment that other officers intervened. Two uniformed cops rushed forward, their faces pale with shock. One of them shouted, "Mark, what are you doing? Stand down." Another officer stepped between Mark and Elena, shielding her from harm. The sudden intervention broke the spell, snapping Mark out of his rage-induced haze. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his weapon, though his expression remained defiant. By now, the entire precinct was in chaos. Officers scrambled to contain the situation, ushering bystanders away and cordoning off the area. Someone called for backup while another radioed headquarters to report the incident. News of what had happened spread quickly, first among those present and then beyond. Within minutes, videos of the altercation began appearing online, capturing every detail of the shocking encounter. For Elena, the moments after the incident passed in a blur. She was escorted inside the precinct for safety, where she sat quietly, processing what had just occurred. Though she appeared outwardly calm, her mind raced with questions. How could this have happened? What did it say about the state of law, enforcement in America? And most importantly, what steps needed to be taken to ensure something like this never happened again? Meanwhile, Mark was isolated in another part of the building, surrounded by internal affairs investigators. His colleagues avoided eye contact, their expressions a mix of anger, disappointment, and disbelief. Word traveled fast, and soon everyone knew what had transpired. Some defended Mark, claiming he was simply reacting to a stressful situation. Others condemned his actions, calling them reckless and unacceptable. Regardless of opinions, one thing was certain: there would be consequences. As night fell, the town buzzed with talk of the incident. Social media lit up with posts, comments, and debates. Videos of the confrontation went viral, sparking outrage across the nation. People demanded answers, calling for transparency and accountability. Protesters began organizing rallies, planning marches to demand justice and reform. Lawmakers issued statements condemning the use of excessive force, while civil rights groups seized the opportunity to highlight systemic issues within policing. Back at the precinct, Elena reflected on the day's events. She knew this wouldn't end quietly. It couldn't. Too much was at stake. This wasn't just about her or Mark, it was about the larger conversation surrounding race, bias, and trust in law enforcement. As the director of the FBI, she had a responsibility to lead by example. She vowed to use this moment as a catalyst for change, no matter how challenging the road ahead might be. And so, as the hours ticked by, the wheels of justice began turning. Investigations were launched, policies reviewed, and reforms proposed. The stage was set for a reckoning, one that would test the strength of institutions, the resilience of communities, and the courage of individuals willing to fight for a better future. By the time dawn broke over the small town, the story of what had happened outside the police precinct was already making headlines across the country. The video footage captured by bystanders had gone viral overnight, shared millions of times on social media platforms, and broadcasted repeatedly on news channels. People couldn't stop talking about it. From living rooms to office break rooms, conversations centered around the shocking image of a police officer pointing a gun at the FBI director. It wasn't just the act itself that stunned everyone. It was the symbolism behind it. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It represented something much bigger. Law enforcement agencies scrambled to respond. At the local level, the police chief called an emergency press conference early in the morning. Standing before cameras and reporters, he looked visibly shaken. His hands trembled slightly as he held up a written statement. "What occurred last night is unacceptable," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "The actions of Officer Mark Reynolds do not reflect the values of this department or the trust placed in us by the community. Effective immediately, Officer. Reynolds has been terminated from his position." The announcement sent ripples through the room. Reporters fired questions at him, their pens scribbling furiously in notebooks. "Was racism a factor in this incident?" one asked. Another pressed. "Will there be criminal charges filed against Officer Reynolds?" The chief hesitated briefly before responding. "We are cooperating fully with federal investigators to determine the circumstances surrounding this event. Any further legal action will depend on the findings of those investigations." As the press conference unfolded, the fallout continued to spread. News outlets dissected every detail of the confrontation, replaying the videos frame by frame. Commentators debated whether Mark's behavior stemmed from personal prejudice or if it was symptomatic of deeper systemic issues within policing. Social media exploded with reactions. Some posts praised Elena Martinez for her composure under pressure, calling her a hero who stood firm in the face of injustice. Others expressed outrage, demanding accountability not only for Mark, but also for the system that allowed such behavior to persist. For Mark, the consequences came swiftly. By sunrise, internal affairs officers had stripped him of his badge and confiscated his weapon. He was escorted out of the precinct building, his head bowed low as flashes from cameras illuminated his face. Reporters shouted questions at him, but he remained silent, refusing to engage. Later that day, he was formally served with termination, papers officially ending his 20-year career in law enforcement. Friends and family rallied around him, claiming he had been set up or misunderstood. But public opinion leaned heavily against him. To many, his actions spoke louder than any defense could. Amidst the chaos, Elena Martinez found herself thrust into the spotlight. She had always been a private person, someone who preferred working quietly behind the scenes rather than seeking attention. But now she had no choice but to step forward. Calls poured in from journalists, politicians, and advocacy groups, all wanting to hear her side of the story. She agreed to give a single televised interview, choosing a reputable network known for its balanced reporting. Sitting in a quiet studio, dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, she addressed the nation with poise and clarity. "I want to make one thing clear," she began, her voice steady and measured. "This incident was not about me personally. It was about the broader issues we face as a society, issues of bias, accountability, and trust. What happened outside that precinct should never have occurred. But I believe it presents an opportunity, a chance for us to confront these challenges head-on and work toward meaningful change." Her words resonated deeply with viewers. Many saw her as a symbol of resilience, someone who refused to let fear or anger dictate her response. When asked how she felt during the confrontation, she admitted that she had been scared, but not for herself. "I was thinking about my team, my colleagues, and the communities we serve. If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. That's why we need to address these problems urgently." Elena's interview marked a turning point in the national conversation. For days afterward, discussions about race, policing, and institutional reform dominated the airwaves. Civil rights organizations seized the moment to push for long-overdue changes. They organized rallies and marches, drawing thousands of people into the streets. Protesters carried signs with slogans like "Justice over bias" and "Accountability now." In cities across the country, similar demonstrations took place, uniting people from diverse backgrounds in a shared call for progress. Meanwhile, lawmakers sprang into action. Congressional hearings were scheduled to examine the state of law enforcement practices nationwide. Senators and representatives grilled experts, advocates, and officials, asking tough questions about training protocols, oversight mechanisms, and disciplinary measures. One particularly heated exchange focused on implicit bias training. Critics argued that current programs were insufficient, often treated as mere checkboxes rather than transformative tools. Advocates countered that while training alone wouldn't solve everything, it was a critical starting point. Back in the town where the incident occurred, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as possible. The local police department implemented new policies aimed at rebuilding trust with the community. Officers attended mandatory workshops on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. Community leaders were invited to participate in roundtable discussions, offering feedback on how the department could improve. While some residents appreciated these efforts, others remained skeptical, questioning whether real change was truly possible. For Mark, the days following his termination were isolating. Stripped of his identity as a police officer, he struggled to find purpose. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with someone embroiled in controversy. Family members tried to support him, but even they couldn't ignore the gravity of his actions. Lawyers advised him to prepare for potential criminal charges, warning that the case would likely attract significant media attention. As he sat, alone in his home watching news coverage of the incident, he couldn't help but wonder how things had spiraled so far out of control. Despite the turmoil, Elena remained steadfast in her mission. She traveled to various cities, meeting with community leaders, law enforcement officials, and policymakers. Her goal was simple yet ambitious: to bridge the gap between citizens and those sworn to protect them. During one such visit, she spoke to a group of young activists passionate about reform. Listening intently to their concerns, she nodded thoughtfully. "Change won't happen overnight," she told them, "but if we keep pushing, keep speaking up, and refuse to settle for anything less than fairness and justice, we'll get there." Her words inspired hope, even in the darkest moments. Though the road ahead promised to be difficult, Elena believed firmly that progress was possible. Every challenge, every setback, and every triumph brought lessons that could shape a better future. And as the sun set on another day, casting golden hues over the horizon, she reminded herself, and everyone listening, that the fight for equality and accountability was far from over. It was a journey worth taking, no matter how long it might take. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of emotions, debates, and calls for action. The story of Officer Mark Reynolds pointing a gun at FBI Director Elena Martinez had ignited a firestorm across the nation, sparking conversations that ranged from heated arguments to heartfelt reflections. As people grappled with the implications of what had happened, the country seemed divided, split between those who demanded accountability and reform and others who clung to old beliefs about law enforcement. On one side of the debate stood those who saw the incident as undeniable proof of systemic racism within policing. Civil rights organizations, community activists, and ordinary citizens took to the streets, organizing protests and rallies in cities large and small. Signs reading "Justice over Bias," "No More Excuses," and "Reform Now" filled public squares, while chants echoed through neighborhoods. Protesters carried portraits of Elena Martinez, holding her up as a symbol of courage and resilience. To them, she wasn't just an FBI director. She was a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of hostility, dignity and determination could prevail. Social media amplified these voices, turning hashtags like "UR's Accountability Matters" and "Stand with Elena" into rallying cries. Videos of the confrontation continued to circulate, accompanied by commentary from influencers, scholars, and everyday users. Some shared personal stories of encounters with law enforcement, highlighting moments when they felt targeted or mistreated because of their race or background. Others posted educational threads, breaking down the history of racial bias in policing and offering suggestions for how to create meaningful change. The online conversation became a digital march, uniting people from all walks of life in pursuit of justice. But not everyone agreed. On the other side of the divide, some defended Mark Reynolds, insisting that his actions, while extreme, weren't entirely unjustified. Talk radio hosts and opinion columnists argued that he was simply doing his job under pressure, suggesting that Elena's presence outside the precinct might have been misinterpreted. He didn't know who she was, one commentator said during a televised segment. In that moment, he thought he was dealing with a potential threat. You can't blame him for reacting the way he did. These statements drew sharp criticism, with critics accusing defenders of excusing blatant misconduct and perpetuating harmful stereotypes. Even within law enforcement circles, opinions varied. Some officers expressed embarrassment and disappointment, acknowledging that Mark's behavior tarnished the reputation of an entire profession. They called for stricter oversight and better training, emphasizing the importance of earning public trust. Others, however, pushed back against what they described as unfair scrutiny. "We're out here every day risking our lives," one veteran cop wrote in an open letter published online. "It's easy to sit behind a keyboard and criticize, but try walking in our shoes for a day. This is a tough job, and sometimes mistakes happen." The polarization extended beyond rhetoric. In several states, lawmakers introduced bills aimed at addressing police misconduct and promoting transparency. Some proposed measures included mandatory body cameras for all officers, independent review boards to investigate complaints, and harsher penalties for violations of protocol. Supporters hailed these initiatives as long overdue steps toward accountability. Opponents, meanwhile, warned that such policies would undermine morale among law enforcement personnel and make it harder for them to do their jobs effectively. Amidst the noise, Elena Martinez remained a central figure in the national dialogue. Her calm demeanor and unwavering commitment to fairness earned her widespread admiration, but also placed immense pressure on her shoulders. Everywhere she went, people approached her with gratitude, tears, and requests for advice. Strangers hugged her tightly, thanking her for standing firm in the face of danger. Students sent letters asking how they could help fight injustice. Community leaders invited her to speak at events, hoping her words would inspire others to take action. Yet despite the support, Elena carried the weight of the incident deeply within her. She often found herself replaying the confrontation in her mind, analyzing each detail and wondering if there was anything she could have done differently. Late at night, when the world grew quiet, she allowed herself to feel the fear and frustration that had lingered since that fateful evening. But instead of letting those emotions consume her, she channeled them into purpose. She knew that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about creating a safer, fairer future for everyone. To further amplify her message, Elena embarked on a nationwide tour, visiting towns and cities where tensions between law enforcement and marginalized communities ran high. In each location, she met with local leaders, listened to residents' concerns, and facilitated discussions about building trust. During one particularly moving event in a predominantly black neighborhood, a young girl raised her hand and asked, "Do you think things will ever get better?" Elena paused, looking directly into the child's eyes before responding. "Yes, I believe they will," she said softly. "But only if we keep working together, speaking up and refusing to give up." Her words resonated far beyond the room, inspiring countless individuals to join the movement for reform. Teachers incorporated lessons about the incident into their classrooms, encouraging students to think critically about issues of race and power. Artists created murals depicting Elena alongside civil rights icons like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, connecting her story to a legacy of resilience and activism. Musicians wrote songs honoring her bravery, performing them at concerts and rallies. Meanwhile, legal proceedings against Mark Reynolds moved forward. Investigators pored over evidence, interviewing witnesses and reviewing video footage frame by frame. Prosecutors weighed multiple charges, including assault with a deadly weapon, official misconduct, and violating departmental policies. While some worried that leniency might send the wrong message, others cautioned against rushing to judgment without considering all the facts. The case became a lightning rod for broader discussions about accountability and redemption. As weeks turned into months, the incident continued to shape the national conversation. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, privilege, and systemic inequality. For many, it served as a wake-up call, a reminder that progress required more than good intentions. It demanded sustained effort, difficult conversations, and a willingness to challenge entrenched systems. And through it all, Elena remained steadfast in her mission. Though she understood that real change wouldn't come overnight, she refused to lose sight of the bigger picture. Every protest, every policy proposal, and every heartfelt conversation brought the nation one step closer to a brighter future. As she stood before crowds addressing thousands with her trademark poise and passion, she reminded everyone of one simple truth. This isn't just my fight. It's ours. Together, we can build a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued. The journey ahead promised to be challenging, fraught with obstacles and setbacks, but Elena believed firmly that the struggle was worth it. After all, history had shown time and again that even the smallest acts of courage could spark monumental change. And as she looked out at the sea of faces listening intently to her words, she knew that the fight for justice was far from over. It was just beginning. As the weeks turned into months, the legal proceedings against Officer Mark Reynolds moved steadily forward, drawing widespread attention from across the country. The courtroom became a stage where the complexities of justice, accountability, and systemic bias played out in real time. Reporters crowded the hallways outside, eager to capture every detail of the trial. Inside, rows of spectators sat silently, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. For many, this case represented more than just one man's actions. It symbolized a reckoning for an entire system. The prosecution painted a damning picture of Mark's behavior that fateful evening. They argued that his decision to draw his weapon was not only reckless but also rooted in prejudice. This wasn't about protecting public safety, the lead prosecutor declared during opening statements. It was about power and the misuse of it. Officer Reynolds saw someone he didn't think belonged in authority and chose to assert dominance through intimidation. That is unacceptable under any circumstances. To support their case, prosecutors presented video footage of the incident, playing it multiple times for the jury. Each replay highlighted the tension in Mark's posture, the dismissive way he treated Elena's credentials, and the chilling moment when he pulled his gun. Eyewitnesses who had been present that night took the stand, recounting how frightened they felt as events unfolded. One woman described clutching her child tightly, afraid of what might happen next. Another witness, a retired police officer himself, testified that Mark's actions violated every principle of professionalism he'd learned during his own career. Defense attorneys fought back fiercely, attempting to cast doubt on the narrative being built against their client. They argued that Mark had acted out of confusion rather than malice, suggesting that the chaotic scene outside the precinct left him unsure of how to respond. He made a mistake, a serious one. But does that mean we throw away decades of service? The defense attorney asked rhetorically. We're human beings, not robots. Mistakes happen, even among those tasked with protecting us. Despite these efforts, cracks began to show in Mark's defense. Cross-examinations revealed inconsistencies in his testimony, particularly regarding why he failed to recognize Elena's authority despite clear identification. Experts called by the prosecution dismantled claims that his actions were justified, pointing out glaring violations of protocol. A former FBI agent testified that no reasonable officer would escalate a situation involving a high-ranking official without first verifying their identity and intentions. This wasn't ambiguity or confusion, the expert stated firmly. This was arrogance and disregard for proper procedure. While the trial dominated headlines, broader reforms gained momentum nationwide. Law enforcement agencies, spurred by public outcry, began implementing sweeping changes aimed at addressing systemic issues within policing. Training programs were revamped to emphasize cultural sensitivity, de-escalation techniques, and implicit bias awareness. Independent oversight boards were established to review complaints against officers, ensuring investigations remained transparent and impartial. Some departments adopted stricter use of force policies, requiring officers to exhaust all non-lethal options before resorting to firearms. Elena Martinez played a pivotal role in spearheading these reforms. She traveled extensively, meeting with lawmakers, community leaders, and law enforcement officials to advocate for change. Her message was consistent yet compelling. Reform wasn't about punishing officers. It was about creating systems that fostered trust and accountability. During one congressional hearing, she delivered a powerful speech urging legislators to prioritize funding for community-based initiatives over militarized equipment. True security comes from building relationships, not fear, she said, her voice resonating through the chamber. When people feel respected and valued, they're more likely to collaborate with law enforcement, not resist it. Her advocacy extended beyond policy changes. Recognizing the importance of education, Elena partnered with schools and universities to develop curricula focused on civics, ethics, and social justice. She believed that teaching young people about equity and empathy could plant seeds for future generations. At a middle school assembly in a predominantly minority neighborhood, she encouraged students to speak up when they witnessed injustice. "Your voices matter," she told them. "Change starts with you, right here, right now." Not everyone welcomed these reforms with open arms. Critics argued that increased oversight stifled officers' ability to perform their duties effectively. Some departments faced pushback from rank-and-file members who felt unfairly scrutinized. Union representatives lobbied against certain measures, claiming they placed undue burdens on already overstretched resources. Despite these challenges, advocates pressed on, emphasizing that meaningful progress often required uncomfortable adjustments. Meanwhile, the verdict in Mark's trial loomed large. After weeks of deliberation, the jury reached a decision. As the courtroom filled with anticipation, Mark sat rigidly in his chair, his face pale and expressionless. When the judge entered and instructed the foreperson to read the verdict, a hush fell over the room. "Guilty," came the response, followed by gasps and murmurs from the audience. Mark was convicted on multiple counts, including assault with a deadly weapon and official misconduct. Sentencing would follow shortly, but the conviction itself sent shockwaves throughout the nation. For many, the guilty verdict felt like vindication, a sign that accountability was possible, even in cases involving law enforcement. Protesters gathered outside courthouses across the country, cheering and chanting slogans celebrating the outcome. Social media erupted with messages of relief and gratitude. "Justice served," read one widely shared post. "Today we take another step toward a fairer society." But others viewed the verdict differently. Supporters of Mark expressed disappointment, arguing that the punishment didn't fit the crime. Online forums buzzed with debates about whether the sentence would deter similar incidents or simply fuel resentment among officers. Even some neutral observers questioned whether focusing solely on individual accountability addressed the root causes of systemic bias. Through it all, Elena maintained her focus on the bigger picture. While she acknowledged the significance of the verdict, she reminded everyone that true transformation required sustained effort. Speaking at a national summit on policing reform, she emphasized the need for collaboration between communities and law enforcement. "This isn't about winners or losers," she said. "It's about finding common ground and working together toward solutions. We must hold ourselves accountable, not because we're forced to, but because it's the right thing to do." As the dust settled, the incident continued to shape conversations about race, power, and justice. It inspired books, documentaries, and art projects exploring themes of resilience and resistance. Schools incorporated lessons about the event into their history curricula, encouraging students to reflect on its implications. In neighborhoods once divided by mistrust, new dialogues emerged, fostering understanding and cooperation. Mark's sentencing marked the end of one chapter but signaled the beginning of another. Sentenced to several years in prison, he disappeared from public view, leaving behind a legacy of controversy. For Elena, the journey ahead promised to be challenging, yet rewarding. She knew that while the road to reform was long and winding, each step brought the nation closer to realizing its ideals of fairness and equality. And so, as the sun set on another day, casting warm hues across the horizon, Elena stood tall, ready to continue fighting for a better future. She understood that change wouldn't come easily, But she also knew that persistence and courage could move mountains. With unwavering determination, she vowed to keep pushing forward, reminding everyone that the fight for justice was far from over. Months after the trial concluded, life in the small town and across the nation began to settle into a new rhythm. The conviction of Officer Mark Reynolds sent a powerful message about accountability, but it also left lingering questions about redemption and healing. For some, justice had been served, and the guilty verdict was a step toward addressing systemic issues within law enforcement. For others, the scars ran too deep for any court ruling to fully mend. Yet, amidst the complexity of emotions, one thing became clear. This moment would not be forgotten. It had sparked a movement, a collective push for change that refused to fade away. Mark's imprisonment marked the end of his career and public life, but it didn't erase the impact of his actions. Behind bars, he struggled to come to terms with what he had done. Letters from former colleagues arrived sporadically, some offering support, others expressing disappointment. Family visits were tense and infrequent, as even those closest to him grappled with the shame of his choices. In quiet moments, Mark replayed the incident in his mind, trying to understand how things had spiraled so far out of control. Was it pride, prejudice, or simply a failure to recognize the humanity of another person? Whatever the reason, the weight of his mistakes pressed heavily on him. He began attending counseling sessions offered by the prison, hoping to confront the biases that had shaped his worldview for so long. Outside the walls of the correctional facility, Elena Martinez continued her work with renewed determination. The incident had taken a toll on her personally. Sleepless nights, moments of doubt, and the constant pressure of being in the spotlight. But she refused to let it break her spirit. Instead, she channeled her energy into creating lasting change. Her advocacy expanded beyond policy reform. She focused on fostering empathy and understanding between communities and law enforcement. She launched a nationwide initiative called Bridging the Divide, which brought officers and citizens together for open dialogues, workshops, and collaborative projects aimed at rebuilding trust. One such event took place in the very town where the confrontation occurred. Hundreds of residents gathered in a local park, sharing stories, asking tough questions, and finding common ground. Officers sat side by side with community members, listening intently as people spoke about their fears, frustrations, and hopes for the future. A young mother recounted how her son had been unfairly stopped by police, while an officer shared his own struggles with burnout and fear on the job. By the end of the day, tears had turned into laughter, and strangers had become allies. Elena watched quietly from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride. This, she realized, was what real progress looked like. Not just policies on paper, but hearts and minds coming together. The ripple effects of the incident reached far beyond the town. Across the country, similar initiatives sprang up, inspired by Elena's example. Cities implemented programs pairing officers with mentors from marginalized communities, encouraging mutual learning and respect. Schools introduced curriculum, modules focusing on conflict resolution and cultural awareness, teaching children the importance of treating everyone with dignity. Artists created murals and performances celebrating unity, while musicians wrote songs that captured both the pain and promise of the times. Even Hollywood took notice, producing films and documentaries exploring themes of justice, bias, and reconciliation. Despite these strides, challenges remained. Not every department embraced reform willingly, and resistance persisted in certain corners of law enforcement. Some officers felt alienated by increased scrutiny, arguing that their efforts to protect and serve were being overshadowed by negative portrayals. Others worried that reforms might compromise their ability to respond effectively in dangerous situations. Critics of the changes pointed to rising crime rates in certain areas as evidence that policing needed more resources, not less. These debates highlighted the complexities of balancing safety, fairness, and accountability, a task that required patience, creativity, and compromise. Elena understood the difficulty of navigating these tensions. She often reminded audiences that reform wasn't about vilifying law enforcement. It was about holding everyone, including herself, to higher standards. During a keynote speech at a national conference, she addressed a room filled with police, chiefs, activists, and policymakers. "We're all human," she said, her voice steady, yet compassionate. "We make mistakes, we harbor biases, and sometimes we hurt each other, even when we don't mean to. But acknowledging our flaws is the first step toward growth. Let's commit to doing better, not because we have to, but because we owe it, to ourselves and to future generations." Her words resonated deeply, earning standing ovations and sparking conversations that carried long after the event ended. People saw in Elena not just a leader, but a bridge builder, a person who could navigate the gray areas of morality and governance with grace and wisdom. Invitations poured in from around the world, asking her to share her insights with global audiences facing similar struggles. From Europe to Africa to Asia, nations wrestling with issues of inequality and injustice looked to her story as a source of inspiration. Yet, for all her accomplishments, Elena never lost sight of her roots or her purpose. She returned frequently to the neighborhoods where she grew up, visiting schools, churches, and community centers. There, she listened to the voices of those still fighting for recognition and representation. She hugged mothers grieving the loss of sons and daughters to police violence. She shook hands with teenagers dreaming of careers in law enforcement, determined to prove that change was possible from within. Each interaction reminded her why she had chosen this path in the first place: to ensure that no one else would have to endure the pain and indignity she had faced that evening outside the precinct. As years passed, the memory of the incident evolved from a flashpoint of outrage to a symbol of resilience and transformation. Textbooks included it in chapters about civil rights and social justice, framing it as a turning point in America's ongoing quest for equality. Scholars studied it, analyzing its implications for race relations, institutional accountability, and grassroots activism. Artists immortalized it in paintings, sculptures, and digital media, capturing the raw emotion and historical significance of the moment. And in everyday conversations, people referenced it as shorthand for the power of courage and perseverance in the face of adversity. For Elena, the journey was far from over. Though she stepped down as FBI director after serving 2 terms, she remained active in advocacy work, founding an organization dedicated to advancing equity in law enforcement. Through grants, scholarships, and mentorship programs, the organization supported individuals committed to transforming institutions from within. Its motto, "Change starts with us," reflected Elena's enduring belief in the potential for redemption and renewal. Looking back on that pivotal evening, Elena often reflected on the lessons it had taught her. She realized that true strength wasn't about never feeling fear. It was about acting with integrity even when fear threatened to overwhelm you. She learned that accountability wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about creating systems that encouraged honesty and growth. Most importantly, she discovered that redemption wasn't reserved for perfect people. It was available to anyone willing to confront their flaws and strive for something better. And so, as she stood before a crowd of young activists at a rally, years later, Elena smiled warmly, her eyes shining with hope. "This fight isn't easy," she told them, her voice carrying across the sea of faces. "But it's worth it. Every step we take brings us closer to a world where everyone feels safe, valued, and free. So keep speaking up, keep pushing forward, and remember, you are the architects of tomorrow. Together we can build a brighter future." With those words, the audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the air like a promise kept. The road ahead would undoubtedly hold challenges, setbacks, and uncertainties. But as Elena gazed out at the faces filled with determination and dreams, she knew one thing for certain: the flame of justice burned bright, fueled by the courage of ordinary people refusing to accept anything less than extraordinary change.